We're joined now by Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center and author of The Pursuit of Liberty, How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Last Battle Over Power in America. Jeffrey, great to have you. Thank you for your time tonight. Let's start first with this FTC case. The consequences of this go far beyond just one person. Help us understand the context and the potential impact.
They really do. The consequences are that the court could call into question the constitutionality of independent agencies, not only the Federal Trade Commission, but the Federal Communication Commission, and even the Federal Reserve, although it's signaled that the Federal Reserve might be different. Basically, ever since the early 20th century, Congress has set up certain agencies that the president's not allowed to control directly. He can't just fire the director because he doesn't like them. There has to be some good cause. And as far ago as 1935, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously said that was consistent with the Constitution. As long as these agencies exercise quasi-judicial or quasi-legislative functions, then they can be insulated from presidential control. But the Trump administration is arguing that that's unconstitutional because executive power is unitary. In other words, the president has to have total power to fire anyone he appoints. And if the Supreme Court accepts a version of that argument, as it seems likely to do, then it will call into question the constitutionality of agencies that have been accepted for a long time.
Right, and you can see how quickly that those impacts could be widespread. How has the Supreme Court shaped the powers of the executive branch in the past, and how have we seen that change during this administration?
Well, it really goes back to Hamilton and Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton took a very broad view of executive power. Jefferson thought it should be more constrained. And the Supreme Court has tended to strike a middle view, more like James Madison, and it's upheld efforts to insulate some offices from presidential control. But starting in the 1980s, under President Reagan, the court has become much more deferential to sweeping exercises of executive power. And of course, that's the center of all the clashes of the Trump administration involving immigration and the tariffs and birthright citizenship and independent agencies. So this case, in some ways, is the culmination of a test of that unitary executive theory, asking whether the court will essentially say there are no limits on the president's ability to control every officer in the executive branch. And again, the fact that it seems likely to succeed is just a huge deal for the expansion of executive power.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned birthright citizenship. The Supreme Court has agreed to take up a case challenging President Trump's executive order seeking to end birthright citizenship. And this is part of the president's larger immigration agenda. That's going to come later next year. How do you see that issue particularly playing out?
That's one issue where most observers think the court is most likely to check the president, to say you can't do that, to say that his executive order purporting to end birthright citizenship violates the Constitution's guarantee of birthright citizenship. The 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. And ever since the late 19th century, there's been a sweeping consensus on the Supreme Court that that means what it says, and that if you're born here, you're a citizen. The Trump administration's tried to challenge that. The court hasn't weighed in yet. But if the court, as expected, says the president can't end birthright citizenship, that will exercise its first meaningful check on executive power. And of course, the other big case that the court might check the president on is the tariffs, which it heard recently. And that's another case where a strict constructionist court of conservatives might say that the federal law, the statute that he's purporting to exercise those tariffs under, can't be stretched to do what he's trying to do. So if this term the court says no to him on birthright citizenship and no on the tariffs, the fact that it's striking down independent agencies would mean he wouldn't win across the board. But it really is important to stress this independent agencies case is a huge deal. It will affect the whole structure of the federal government for decades to come, including the president's power to fire lower level officials and to end civil service protections that have been on the books for almost 100 years. That's actually another part of the independent agencies case. If the president unlawfully fires someone, does he have to reinstate them, or can he just pay them off? Can he pay money? If the court says you can just pay them off, that means in practice the president could fire any civil servant he wants and just use federal money to pay them off, and that would mean the end of civil service protections that have been on the books since the 19th century.
Yeah, it would be quite a change. All right, Jeffrey Rosen, thank you so much. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you very much.